Yeah, it's a pleasure for me to make this presentation today. I want to talk about open science and how I think open science is a fundamental tool to bring collaboration into projects. It's going to be quite a dense presentation, and I'll try to keep it within 25 minutes. We have then time, hopefully, to have some exchanges. What I'd like to talk about are really some reflections, some ideas about what it means to do a collaborative research action and why they're so important today. And from there to go into open science and actually frame open science as a matter of collaboration before actually thinking a little bit about what it means to use this idea of open science as collaboration to develop better collaborative research actions. So the first part, yes, I want to talk about why we are talking about collaboration, and specifically what I call complex collaboration, which is the type of collaboration that is increasingly asked from researchers, from us, transdisciplinary, multi-stakeholder, multinational collaboration, which I think we can all agree are special in the sense that they require building bridges, they require connecting communities that have different cultures, that have different scientific practices, that have different understanding of the purpose of a project. And this makes this kind of collaborations, this makes this kind of projects very complex in terms of building up the capacity to collaborate. So this is what we're talking about, and we're talking about that not because it is complex for the beauty of it, but because increasingly this type of collaboration is very much in demand. It is something that is identified really throughout the world as something that is essential for research to contribute to the big challenges we have today. And for example, in the context of the Belmont Forum, they have defined, they have the Belmont Challenge, which I'm sure you're all familiar with since it's part of the call for proposals here, which very clearly defines the importance of bringing this kind of complex collaboration on the table in order to solve the difficult problems that exist in development, sustainable development in general. Really, in essence, what I think we are being asked for as researchers is to move away from a thinking where we produce research in order to purely produce knowledge, but to actually produce knowledge that is globally relevant, multinational projects, that is policy relevant. And this is very important. I was talking recently to someone working at a high level in policy making in Switzerland for a minister, telling me about some situation I find in the context of the COVID crisis, about how disappointed they were with the advice and the solutions that scientists brought to them as policymakers, because they were these very narrow technological or single disciplinary problems that were not policy relevant. So this is something that is very much in demand, and the same with capacity building, not just producing research to produce research, but to produce capacity, engaging stakeholders, etc. So this is the reality in which we are. And I think it's very important that we as researchers take this seriously and actually have solutions to answer to that. But what it means is that we are in a context where the research project, what we are developing as a research project, becomes something that is very different from what we used to know about research projects. Traditionally, a research project is thought about producing some kind of knowledge. It's about, well, that's the output of research, really. It can be publication, it can be something else, but basically this is what you produce. And when you start bringing in this complex collaboration, multidisciplinary collaboration, multi-stakeholder collaboration, the natural way of thinking about it, the natural way of bringing this into your collaborative research actions is to think of it as simply another tool, another resource you have available in order to produce knowledge. The case I'm trying to make here is that I think this is the wrong way of thinking about it. In general, it's incredibly difficult to produce projects where the multidisciplinary, the multi-stakeholder is purely a resource. What you really need to think about is that actually these collaborative research actions change very much in their nature, in that the collaboration itself becomes a key output, a key outcome of what the project is aimed to do. The relationships that you build with other disciplines, with actors in other countries, with stakeholders outside of research, are not just a tool to produce better knowledge, but they become very much part of what the outcome of the collaborative research action is. And I think this is really what this ask that we see today in terms of bringing in multi whatever into projects is asking for. It's don't give us only knowledge, give us also the relationships that allow us to make value, to create value out of it. Now, this is very difficult, and we all know how challenging this is. And And in practice, what it leads in many cases is we end up with a lot of collaboration that is really purely performative. We have, I don't know, some kind of milestone in a project or a collaboration workshop, so you can say, well, we did it. And everyone knows this is not serious collaboration for its own sake. It's disappointing for everyone. And what I'm trying to say here, to propose here, is that this is really something we need to avoid. It's serving no one. It's not serving us as researchers. We might be ticking the box, but in the end, it's incredibly frustrating. And really, we're wasting taxpayers' money, which is not something we should be doing. And in addition, I think it's just not fun. Researchers engaging in this kind of collaborative research can really bring much more on the table. Now, this is the first part. I just wanted to frame a little bit this notion of complex collaboration, talking about how important it is to solve the big challenges that really cannot be solved if we don't think about them like that. And that's also what society expects from research. And in addition to that, the notion that relationships or the capacity to collaborate is really what we want more and more as the outcome of a research project, a collaborative research project, more than the knowledge itself. And this is something that we increasingly should become capable of delivering, because it's something that really has added value for everyone. Now, the second part of my presentation, having said that, I want to talk a little bit about open science and to frame the history of open science, again, in the context of collaboration, because I think this is something that is absolutely essential and maybe not always understood fully. Let's step back a little bit. Let's step actually back quite a lot and go back at the very beginning of what we would call modern science. I'm going to try to explain that I think science is very much fundamentally at its heart collaboration. What happened in the 17th century, in the first scientific revolution, when science evolved from being essentially a science of secrets. I mean, the caricature is the alchemist in his tower, in his dungeon, whose scientific activity concerned that was very much done in secret. It was about keeping knowledge for himself or for his master. And of course, this science didn't lead very far. The science of that secret science was a very weak capacity, had a very weak capacity to produce knowledge. And what the 17th century science invented is the idea that actually science should be done together. The sentence at the time was standing on the shoulders of giants. You are not alone in making science, you are building it collaboratively together. But in order to be able to do that, in order to get out of the dungeon and into this kind of open science that the 17th century invented, where you would do your science in public and share it with other researchers, required a whole lot of infrastructure to be built. It was the invention of the scientific journal, of peer review, of essentially how all of that would work together in order to create knowledge. And this collaboration led to, and this science thought as collaboration is incredibly powerful. I mean, the way science advanced once you started to think about it in this open fashion was absolutely tremendous. And I want to give a little example of how far this can go with CERN, which I think is a very interesting example of what collaboration can mean and really pushes us also towards open science. Because so CERN, the Center for Centre de la Recherche en Énergie Nucléaire, basically the big research center for particle physics in Geneva, it's this huge infrastructure that costs billions and billions. And that emerged about 50 years ago when essentially this community of particle physicists realized that the toys they wanted to play with as researchers were simply too expensive for a single researcher to own one alone. And they had to come together, and they were forced to come together because what they were doing is too expensive. Now, this was a huge boon for the discipline, because once they had this common object on which they were working, the particle accelerator, it forced them to think of themselves as a community that was working together, that was working towards a common goal with the same tools. And it allowed the particle physics community to be this hugely influential field of research. But in addition, it's also a field that I think was one of the places where modern thinking about open science emerged. The World Wide Web, which you may or may not know, was actually created at CERN by a CERN employee for CERN, Tim Berners-Lee, who, well, created it as part of his work at CERN, very much at the very beginning, and this is a historic document here, the first email in which Tim Berners-Lee explains what CERN means for him, created it as a tool to share more academic information and make it freely available to everyone. So we can really see how this is at the core of collaboration, how our modern technologies, the web, very much have this idea of scientific collaboration at the core. And I think this is what we are talking about when we talk about open science. It is the 21st century version of the revolution we saw in the 20th century, recreating the kind of collaboration that we need in order for science to advance further in a time when the 17th century way of thinking about collaboration looks more and more outdated, whether it's the technologies we have, the capacities to use the web, to create information and to think of information as something that's interconnected, the reality of science that is increasingly data intensive and computational, but also the social structure. I mean, the 17th century was a fundamentally non-inclusive and non-democratic time. And this is not something that we want in modern collaboration. So this, for me, is what we have to think about in terms of open science today. And in fact, increasingly, this is also how open science is defined. This is very new. This is something which, this way of thinking about open science and understanding that open science is something that is very new, but it's now really finding its way into the public discourse. The very recent UNESCO recommendation Open Science, which was released late last year, is actually very good at trying to head in that direction and describe open science in that sense. I copied here this little graph that is part of the UNESCO recommendation. You can look at it, and I recommend you read it. It's very interesting. Really highlights open science as something that aims to increase scientific collaboration and sharing of information for the benefit of science society, to make knowledge openly available and accessible and reusable for everyone, or to open the process of scientific knowledge creation beyond the traditional scientific community. So we're really at the heart of this reinvention of what collaboration means. So in short, I really think that collaboration should be thought as a foundation of science. And the fact that collaboration is changing radically today is what we need to understand when you think about open science. Open science is using the full potential of today's collaboration in order to respond to the growing societal expectations vis-a-vis research. And here I'm explicitly making the link to what I was talking about at the beginning with the big challenges that require this type of collaboration with stakeholders and disciplines, and therefore also leverage the scientific potential to create something better. Now, of course, when we think about open science, what you are confronted to, what you have as obligations as researchers, what we have as obligations as researchers when developing a project in terms of open science are very far from this revolutionary vision that I just described. In reality, when we think about open science requirements, I would say there are really two basic requirements that you find everywhere, whether it's funders or institutions that require it. One is to ask for open access, which is basically to say that we want to adopt free-to-use licenses for publications, hopefully not just for publications, but also other scientific outputs. And the second is to improve reproducibility by sharing data that's needed to reproduce results, typically results that have been published in a paper, because of course, a paper in which you nicely write what you did increasingly becomes irrelevant if you want to actually reproduce some research. So all of that is very good and important, and I'm not going to talk about it much more because this is really not what I'm fundamentally interested in. There is not the potential for collaboration if open science is reduced to that. This is something you need to do, but it's not what I want to talk about. The truth is that open science, and that's what I was saying before when talking about the UNESCO recommendation, it can really be seen as something that gives much more opportunities than that. Again, I'm taking here a little graph that was part of the UNESCO recommendation, which shows this like 4 quadrants that represent the different type of what I would call open science resources. And that are the areas in which you can think of open science as something to build on, to build into your project. Open science knowledge, which covers everything from data, software, also open education resources, for example. Open science infrastructures, which are not knowledge, but are actually the places, whether physical places or virtual places in which research is being conducted. And this is hugely important to understand that opening doors is also necessary if you want to have collaboration to take place. Living labs, collaborative labs are becoming a very big factor of thinking about open science. And then there is the elements of open science that are more about engaging other stakeholders, open dialogue with other knowledge system that can be either other disciplines or that can be other traditional knowledge, for example, or also knowledge that's available, for example, in industry. And of course, the open engagement of societal actor, which is to bring in more of society, not just by informing them about science, but actually bringing them as part in that. And these two, the last two, the dialogue and the engagement, are resources because the capability to do that, the capacity to do that is something you need to build up. It's a resource that you have or that you don't have. It's not something you just do out of the blue. Now, these resources are all very good, but by themselves, they're not enough. You have to think in terms of the practices you build on top of these resources, because a resource by itself, if it doesn't have a purpose, it's not worth much. And a purpose can be anything from a scientific agenda, like what I was saying before about the CERN, where the whole community has a very clear idea about the kind of science they want to do together by building on their open shared infrastructure, or some kind of societal goal that you're trying to build by on top of this resource. In order for this purpose to actually be reachable, you need to have common usages and places. In some cases can be very practical. What are the technical standards for the data you're going to share so that it's useful to everyone, or the social norms you have in order to use some kind of open resource. And in practice, what this creates are new communities typically around these open science resources. And finally, for all of this to be possible, it needs to be integrated in everyday research. Open is not something you do at the end of a project when you open the outcome, but it's something you have to think about from the start in order for it to be useful for a whole community. A little example here that I find actually that I found very interesting. Something I'm not directly involved in, but that I've heard about quite closely, and which I think is a very interesting project. It's part of an initiative called Excellence in Africa, whatever. Which is basically a partnership around research and higher education between a university in the north, EPFL, and a series of universities in various African countries around topics like urban development and rural development and issues like this. And one thing they wanted to do was to improve the quality of education, work on education together to create better material to teach the next generation of actors on this field. And originally their plan was to develop a MOOC, a massive online open courseware. So basically someone or a consortium would develop this MOOC, make it available, and the same course would be available to all students across this partnership or in the universities in this partnership. And simply could sit a student in front of their computer or their cell phone and have a look at the MOOC. But very quickly they realized that this was actually completely counterproductive, because what it meant is that the teachers, the educators in the countries that would benefit potentially from this new MOOC would be completely left out, would be out of a job, would lose their connection to the students and would lose their capacity to be educators in these things. So instead, they thought about making this something else, an open education resource, which is basically to think of it as a platform where they collectively produce very small fragments of courses, whether a small video or some infographic or a pre-prepared exercise that represents a library or a resource of little pieces that then educators and professors can integrate into their course to bring it to the next level while maintaining full ownership of what they are doing. And this is really how you can think about a partnership. This is how collaboration can emerge by integrating an open practice, in this case, thinking about education as an open education resource that creates a collaboration that is about partnership rather than simply someone imposing some specific outcome to the rest of the group. Now, open science, as I said, the basics, what you are required to do is all very good and probably useful, but it's not what's going to drive collaboration. For that, you have to be more ambitious about how you think about open science, and especially think about open science practices. What is the community you want to build? What is the purpose, and how you're going to do it to use this kind of open resource? Now, to conclude this presentation, and this last section is hopefully going to be very short, I want to talk about, well, what do we do here? I hope I gave you a very rapid and general understanding of why I think bringing in open science practices and open science resources into a project can really structure the type of complex collaboration that is required in terms of solving the big challenges that we all try to solve. Now, how will we do that in practice? This is not going to be a detailed course. I'm afraid I don't have the time for that, but I'm going to talk about 3 steps, which I think are useful to integrate into the preparation of a proposal, to introduce what we call in Ideas Belong the inception phase, which is basically this very moment at the beginning of a collaboration where you put everything on the table with the partners and say, is that what we want to do, and are we going to be happy if we do that together? So 3 steps. The first step is, and this refers to one of the first slides I was showing, with the fact that a collaboration project, to really think about it in its full depth, you have to think as the collaboration as a goal of it, as an outcome and a goal of the project in itself. It's not about producing knowledge where the collaboration or the multi-stakeholder partnership is about creating new capabilities, but it's really a goal in itself, this collaboration. And this is something that is not obvious. It's something that is in many cases new to people, and that has to be put on the table. Because in the end, it means turning around how you think about multidisciplinary, multinational, multi-stakeholder collaboration by saying that the people from the other disciplines, from the other nationalities, the other stakeholders are not resources that you can bring in to reach the project goal, but that they're actually partners in it. And everyone has to be on board for that. And it's not obvious, it's something you need to discuss in the project development. The second point is, now that you know that and you want to think of it in terms of open science, is to actually identify what is the open science resource. I gave the example of this open education resource as a good example of how you could like use this collection or this landscape of open science resource to identify something that will really help you collaborate. In many cases, data is a very good open science resource, etc. But what is important is that it has a purpose, that you know why you are going to share it, especially if you involve people from other disciplines or stakeholders outside of research. The purpose of why you want to share, for example, data is probably not going to be the same for everyone. So understanding that is important, because in the end, an open science resource lives not simply because it is open, but because it is used. And the contributor and the user in that sense are equal partners in an open science resource. It has to be a purpose for everyone, and this is something you need to work out and you need to find. The last point that is probably important to also clarify is that once you make the effort to create an open science resource, it's a resource that is probably going to be, if you're just doing it for the purpose of the project, there is no real benefit of making it open, or rather the effort of making it open is probably not worth it. You want it to live longer than that. But for that, it means you need to be sure that it's actually possible, that there is the willingness to open it and to make it an open resource. Some people might not be willing or legally allowed to share data. So this is something you really need to work out and understand. And of course, whether afterwards you will have the means or you have some kind of business plan of how to maintain this in the future. And the third point, if you agree on that, and if you have identified an open science resource and you want to build your collaboration about it, is to actually build a collaboration around it. And hopefully at this point, it's going to be relatively straightforward, because with a clear common purpose, this is something that you can do quite straightforward. But it's not enough, and there are some elements that you really should think about. Outside of like the traditional way of developing a project, it's not about work packages, it's not about deliverables. One thing that matters a lot is community governance. An open resource has to be owned by everyone, and that means you need to have a governance model that gives a voice to everyone, to set things quite concretely, like what is the standard that we're going to use to share the data, or what is the platform and the type of open education resources that we need in order so that we can integrate them into our education. And this is something that everyone has to be able to have a voice in and decide collectively. So governance matters a lot, especially since it probably in most cases someone feels that they are giving away something. Someone is going to be the producer and they think that they are giving away something. Now, in open science, this is simply factually wrong. In most cases, the actor who is the one who contributes the open science resource is also the one that gets the most out of opening it, because it gives them essentially the capacity to be at the center of this collaboration in a way that is a huge benefit, way beyond what the data or the education material in itself has. But still, this is something that probably in most cases is going to be there, it's going to be part of the topic and probably needs to be discussed. And a good way of discussing that is to think about the recognition that you're going to give to everyone involved. For researchers, that means working out the citation practices. Are you going to have a publication together that says, here is our open science resource, and here is why we think it's important, and this is what should be cited in order for other researchers to acknowledge the importance of that? It can be other ways of recognizing the open science resource. And if you're working with other people than researchers, stakeholders outside of research, you probably need to work into other recognition practices for example, policymakers to allow them to build some kind of political capital on it, or for companies, maybe they can have some financial interest, but in more cases, more realistically, some kind of corporate social responsibility that they can gain from being involved in that. So with these 3 steps, I hope I gave you at least some ideas of how I think we can use open science as a framework, and the notion that open science resources are like a focal point of collaboration for building better collaborative research action. With the added benefit that there is a lot of money, of infrastructure, of services, of goodwill around open science today that you can leverage in order to make more out of this. I think that open science practices, and once you find an open science practice, it's a hugely powerful way to connect researchers across disciplines, across nations, also other stakeholders, because it is the very nature of an open science resource to connect people. That is its only purpose, and this is why it's such a powerful tool to do that.